down by ethnic groups, we see that blacks, we top heart disease, we top cancer, we top cerebrovascular disease, we top diabetes, we top kidney disease. Of course, we are not predisposed to all kinds of disease. There are other diseases that really affect other populations more than blacks. But in terms of the health outcomes for the average black person in the United States, the overriding theme is that of disparity and disadvantage. And this really came into focus during the COVID pandemic, where we saw that a lot of minority population, this would be Hispanics, Native Americans, and blacks were disproportionately affected from COVID, and actually we died from COVID more than the other groups. What I'm going to focus about is an underlying condition that really is responsible for a lot of this disease, and that is obesity. Obesity is a major risk factor for diabetes, for kidney failure, for Alzheimer's disease, for strokes, for cancer, and for heart disease. And what we see in America really represent what is happening in the diaspora. You'd be amazed, but the statistics is more or less the same in Canada, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, for instance, and it's probably even worse in France. Unfortunately, these numbers are very similar to what is emerging on the African continent, including Ghana. So obesity, right now, is believed that 1 in every 3 American adult is obese. But now it's becoming a global issue, a global pandemic. So the worldwide obesity rate has tripled in the past 50 years. And this is clearly due to changes in our diet, as well as changes in our physical activity. So we are gradually moving away from our native diet, shown here as banku on a bed of spinach and a gushi stew in spicy palm oil. And also the Ethiopian injera diet, which is whole grain wheat with spicy stews and other whole grain stuff. And we are gradually moving away to a highly processed foods, including your hot dog, your pizza, your donut, and other highly processed foods. These are foods that are very tasty because they are really padded with saturated fats, sugars, and salt. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a major cause of our obesity problem in the United States. So another risk factor is changes in our physical activity. Gone are the days when people used to walk and fetch water from the wells or walk several miles to the farm. And now with urbanization, a lot of folks are basically just driving everywhere. You talk to some friends in Ghana and they are not getting even 10 minutes of physical activity. They get out of their house, the houseboys put their briefcase in their cars, they just sit in the car, drive to work, walk a few steps to the office, sit in the office the whole day, do the same back. So changes in physical activity is really a big factor that is driving the obesity pandemic. So the problem is really not to go back to our rural way of living, but we want to learn from the rural lifestyle, from how our ancestors lived, so that we can get the best of both worlds in the environment that we find ourselves. Okay. So this slide is a paper that was published in one of the reputable journals called Lancet. And this is a very comprehensive study that involved several 100,000 people. And the studies were done in 195 countries between the periods of 1990 to 2017. The outcome of this study is that, so what they did in this study is to look at how diet affects diseases such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. The finding from this study is that diet that is high in salt, low in whole grains, low in fruits, low in nuts and seeds, low in vegetables, and low in omega-3 fatty acid, mostly from seafood, as well as low in fiber. On the other hand, diet that is rich in sugar-saturated beverages, rich in trans fats, and diet that is high in processed meats. These are diets that are significantly associated with diseases such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. So then the question we ask ourselves is, what really constitutes the ideal diet for good health? So we know good diet is linked to good health, poor diet is linked to poor health. So what is the best diet for good health? The question itself assumes that there's an ideal diet, and that's not the case because we all come from different geographic locations. We're exposed to different diets. But some of the well-characterized diets that is good for our health are the so-called Mediterranean diet and dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet. Ketogenic diet, these are diets that is very rich in fats, and the idea is to really reduce diabetes risk. And plant-based diets. So there are other diets such as calorie restriction, where people intentionally will eat about 30% less than they would normally do. Very difficult to do, I may say. Time restriction diet, when people will say, okay, I'm only going to eat between the hours of, let's say, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. I try to do calorie restriction, time restriction diet, eating mostly from 12 until about 10 p.m. And protein-rich diet. So we are able to adapt to a lot of these diets, but the diet that is clearly not good for our health is the current modern Western diet. So all these diets, Mediterranean, ketogenic, plant-based diet, a lot of these diets are Asian diets that has perhaps been repackaged, or we are just beginning to appreciate their benefits. But what we see is that a lot of these diets are very rich in plant-based sources. And I would say that the traditional Ghanaian diet is like Mediterranean diet. Growing up in Ghana, most of our diet was you get kontomire, your garden eggs with some fish. You'd be lucky to get chicken over the weekend. And goat was something you get during Easter and Christmas time. So the diet we had is really plant-based diet. So how come with all of a sudden obesity is going up in Africa? And the answer is clearly the changes in our dietary pattern. So overall, we know that plant-based diet is really one of the best diets. It doesn't mean we should all be vegetarians or vegans. I would not survive on a vegan diet because I would not be able to know how to balance it, right? But our traditional diet is very good for our health. So what is really all the noise about plant-based diet compared to, let's say, diet which is rich in meat? When you compare plant-based diet to, let's say, protein-rich or meat-based diet, we see that plant-based diet is the only source of fiber. Fiber is very good for our health. Fiber helps us in digestion. It helps us in controlling our weight. Actually helps in mopping up some cholesterol from our body. And of course, it helps in bulking up our waste and being able to get rid from our bodies. You wouldn't get any fiber from protein or from meat. Plants is also very rich in phytochemicals and antioxidants, whereas there's no such micronutrients from protein-rich diets. And we know the benefit of these phytochemicals and antioxidants because they really help to mop up a lot of the toxins in our bodies. Plants are also very low in fats, particularly saturated fats, and no cholesterol, whereas meat is rich in saturated fats and cholesterol. On the other hand, plant does not have any heme iron, and we know that we need some amount of iron. So even for those who are vegans, it's recommended that periodically you consume some amount of meat. So the idea is not to cut out meat completely, but to basically reduce the amount of your meat intake. On the other hand, meat is very rich or very high in growth hormones. How we are cultivating our animals is really one of the biggest problems. Why meat is really not very good for us in this environment, because they are boosted with a lot of growth hormones and antibodies, and many of these are really not good for our health. So you don't get some of those hormones and antibodies in plants. And plants are also deficient in some essential amino acids, whereas animal products have all the amino acids, and these amino acids are very good for our health. So again, we are not saying don't eat any meat at all, but modulate your meat intake. So this is why plant-based food is really significantly associated with good health. And we see that people who live in areas called the blue zones, in countries such as the Okinawa, Japan, Italy, Costa Rica, Greece, and so forth. So these are individuals who live, being 100 is common. You go to those places, they all live to be 100 and they are very active. And when you look at their diet, it's really plant-based rich. And I will add that a lot of these studies are only done in the Western world. But in Africa, we have certain pockets of tribes who live to be 100. You go into the mountains, the Kwapin Mountains and the Kovu Mountains, 80s, 90s, people are still living to that age. And you see that they are active, going to the farm and getting the fresh foods and so forth. So clearly, we really need to start thinking about eating the diets of our ancestors if we really want to live, have all the quality lives and live to ripe old age. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've talked about diet, and as a biochemist, we are really interested in knowing what diets do to our bodies. Okay, so all the foods that we eat from which we generate energy is broken down into your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fat. Carbohydrate, of course, is your sugars and your starches. And by the way, all starches are broken down into sugars. So when you eat your cassava, the starch, guess what? It's broken down finally into sugars. So when we eat food, when we eat fat, that really, of course, has nothing to do with, doesn't really boost our insulin level. Okay, I'm going to talk about the hormone insulin. And similarly, when your diet is rich in protein, that increases your insulin level a little bit. But when the diet is rich in sugars, this really significantly boosts your insulin level. We all know about insulin. It's a very important hormone. What does insulin do? It plays a role like a keeper to the door of our cells. So when we eat and our blood sugar goes up, this tells the body, hey, secrete insulin. And insulin will just then open the door to our cells and allow glucose, which is sugar, to go inside the cell. And the cell utilizes the sugar for fuel, for all the energy that we need for our body processes. The picture in the middle, you see a woman, perhaps a mother, holding, this is a 3-year-old boy, emaciated, who is suffering from type 1 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes, as we know, is that this child is not able to produce insulin. And this child was put on insulin injection for 3 months, and you see him, he's double in weight and looking healthy and big. So insulin is clearly a very, very important hormone that regulates our blood sugar level. I think you need a chair. I think you should sit down, man.
He's a young man. That's fine. Yeah, he's young. That's fine.
So insulin clearly plays a role in regulating our glucose level, but insulin also makes us fat. What happens is when insulin level in our body goes up, it tells the body store energy, store energy, store energy, store energy, fat. Okay? So insulin clearly makes us fat. And the only macronutrient that causes insulin level to go up is blood sugar. So when our diet is rich in sugar, we're not talking about the occasional dessert here and there, but if consistently your diet is rich in sugar, which is the typical American diet, guess what? You are constantly causing your insulin level to go up to the point that the cells are not even responding to insulin anymore, creating a condition known as insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to diabetes and many metabolic disorders, including obesity, heart disease, hypertension, and so forth. So, the take-home message from this slide is that we need to modulate our sugar level. Okay? The average American consumes 16 teaspoons of sugar a day. The American Heart Association recommends that women consume about 6 teaspoons of sugar a day. And yes, men will have sweet tooth, so they have added 3 more. So we can consume like 9 teaspoons of sugar every day. But guess what? We are consuming much more than that. So take, for instance, breakfast. If you drink coffee with some sugar, you have sugar there. You're having your eggs with a little bit of ketchup, there's sugar in it. Okay. You're having your toast, all that carbohydrates is converted to sugar. And then come lunch, you're having burger, the bun, the starches is converted to sugar. The fries is sugar. The ketchup is sugar in it. The barbecue sauce, there's sugar in it. The salad cream, there's sugar in it. And then the soda. One medium can of soda has at least 5 teaspoons of sugar. So you see how quickly it adds up. So we really need to be conscious of that and reduce our sugar intake. Okay. So I present this slide to you. Can somebody tell me what is the ideal diet or the best diet of all the 4 here, shown here?
The first or the second?
Number 3 from the left.
Number 3 from the left, or number 4. So, yes, so 2 and 3 are really the ideal diet. Jollof, this is our typical diet, right? Jollof rice and chicken. I mean, look at it, it's colorful and beautiful. You can almost smell it. Okay. But that is not ideal diet. Okay. Number 1, this is a typical vegan diet. It's okay for lunch every now and then. I will not survive on that. Number 3 is balanced. You have your meat, which is chicken. You have your fruits and vegetables, and then you have quinoa. Anybody eats quinoa? Anybody like quinoa? I don't like quinoa.
It's
so
not tasty.
it's not tasty. Now, number 2, that's what we're talking about. This is what we're used to. This is balanced diet also. You have your vegetables, the contumely, you have some eggs protein, you have plant proteins, the avocado, you have some yam, rich in fiber. This is our traditional food and it's balanced diet. The only problem we have with this is the quantity. We don't do 3 pieces of yam, right? We do 6, we do 8. So we need to take into consideration the amount of food that we eat also. But number 2 and number 3, these are ideal diets. So according to US government.gov, just think about it this way. 4 fists. So you have 1 fist of protein. It could be fish. Mostly fish is good, and some meat occasionally. 1 fist of fruit. 1 fist of whole grains. Your wheat, your what do you call it? Quinoa or couscous or whatever. And then 1 fist of vegetables. So when we have that, that is close to an ideal meal for our good health. Next slide. Okay. So that's diet. Another important factor which I alluded to earlier is lack of physical activity or sedentary lifestyle. So this is a very important risk factor for our health. Is believe that at least 100,000 US people die from preventable diseases as a result of inactivity or lack of physical activity. So diseases such as obesity, diabetes, chronic disease. So lack of physical activity is a big contributing factor for those kind of diseases. In other words, we are not created to sit idly, doing nothing, to let us sit all day. We are created to move. Okay, that's how God designed us. Unfortunately, the modern conveniences, nowadays we don't have to go to the farm to get food. You just go to grocery store. If you don't want to do that, we'll bring it to you at your house. Even if you don't want to cook, we'll cook the food and bring it to you. I visited one of the college campus, and I know the students are eating really junk food. And now they have robots that are delivering the food to them. So you want this junk food to stay on our kids and no exercise. This is a problem. Okay. So physical activity is very, very important, our good health. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, we've all gotten worse. Nowadays, a lot of people are really working from home, and we find that we are sitting more than we normally would. I mean, if you are an IT person, you are spending so much time on your laptop, and of course, we are spending 2-3 hours on Zoom meetings every day, and we are sitting too much. So remember, there are no bullet points. Let's move and get our bodies into shape. So physical activity really increases our blood circulation. It helps the body to deliver oxygen and nutrients to all the different parts of our human body. And there are many different ways of physical activity. But I show some of the benefits from physical activity. It really helps treat dementia. and aging, brain aging, it really reduces stress. We need to be physically active. At least 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a day really is effective in helping reduce a lot of the chronic diseases. And it plays so many roles in really helping us to remain sharp and fit. Next slide. So I want to also introduce a concept that may not necessarily be familiar to many people. And this is the so-called microbiome, and in particular our gut microbiome. So as human beings, we are also host to a lot of bacteria, fungi, viruses on our bodies, inside our respiratory system, inside our throat. The ENT specialist is here, and he would attest to that. And also in our gut. And of course, we know some of these viruses are really pathogenic, including the COVID-19 virus, and we all know the consequences of that. But some of these bacteria and fungi play a very, very important role in our overall health. So the primary role of some of these bacteria in our gut, they help us to break down plant materials that human beings who don't necessarily have the enzymes to do that. Okay, so all these bacteria, fungi, and viruses, they are what is known as microbiome. So our gut microbiome, if we eat the right sort of foods, they help us control allergies. They help us in our immune function. In fact, they play a role in maintaining good body weight. So we need diet that contains some sort of bacteria or fermented foods. Our kenke is very good. The fantidokon is very good. Yogurt, and these are all probiotics that contain very good bacteria, good for our health. I just want us to know that the gut is also referred to as the second brain. So we know important hormones such as serotonin. These are hormones that play a role in modulating our mood. Okay. Guess what? 95% of this hormone is actually produced in our stomach. So it's important that we take good care of our stomach by eating the right sort of vegetables, making sure we have our stomach rich of the good bacteria. What are some of the things that can really throw our gut health out of whack? Antibiotics. So we know that sometimes you need the antibiotics to really get rid of bad viruses and bacteria. But guess what? In the process, they also kill some of the good bacteria. So let's not be too... It's scary when you go to Ghana. We just go to the drugstore and they just, I want this antibiotics. You know, it's really, we need to get away from that. It's not good for our health, okay? But on the other hand, fermented food and food that is rich in asparagus, red wine is very good for our stomach gut. These are some of the things that really help us to maintain good body weight. Okay. So another important factor is our sleep-wake pattern, so-called the circadian rhythm. A lot of these hormones that play important biological processes are controlled in the so-called circadian pattern. So we see that I've only listed 3 hormones here, just actually 2. So cortisol, we express cortisol very high during the daytime to really give us the energy to go through the day. And then we want the cortisol level to go down. Cortisol, of course, is the stress hormone. Another important hormone known as the sleep hormone is the melatonin. Melatonin level is very low during the daytime, and this goes up during the sleeping hours. It plays very, very important role in maintaining good health. Okay? We live in a very artificial, light-intense environment. You can stay up all night if you want. There's a lot of light. And Sister Vero is just pointing us the importance of reducing a certain amount of light exposure. So we know that light exposure on the phone and, if we disrupt melatonin secretion, this is really bad for our health. So it's important that we regulate and try as much as we can to get good amount of sleep. The body is able to repair itself. The body needs to reset every 24 hours. So when we sleep, guess what? We go back to the baseline. On the other hand, when we are under chronic stresses, this really leads to a lot of the metabolic conditions that drives a lot of the diseases that is prevalent in our times. Okay. So I've given you some ideas about some of the important factors for our health: diet, physical activity, our gut health, and of course our sleep pattern. So let's look at some of the workable solutions. I mentioned that obesity is a big problem, a big pandemic facing us right now. So the idea is to try to maintain a constant body weight. So we have we measure that by the so-called body mass index. So this really gives you an idea of how much fat. It's a crude measure of how much fat you have on you. And the way it's measured is the ratio of your weight squared over your height. Okay. So can somebody tell me a range or the good number for somebody who has a healthy BMI?
25.
35.
25.
25, thank you. Next slide. Yeah. So this is the range, okay? So if your BMI is 18.5 or lower, you are underweight. If your BMI is, of course, between 18 and 24.9 or 25, that's normal. BMI 25 to 29 is overweight, and BMI over 30 is obese. But of course, there are some confounding variables, so you have to take into consideration people with heavy bone mass, waist circumference, and muscular people. If you don't factor that in, you may actually overestimate the amount of fat on their body. But these numbers gives us the idea, overall idea of, in terms of our body weight, and I am overweight according to this, but I'm not so much worried about being overweight. I think the key is to stay active. There are some obese people, and you'd be amazed, who have perfect metabolic markers. And there are some skinny people, the supermodels, they are not well, who have all kinds of conditions. So you cannot, by looking at somebody's physiological weight, say, oh, this person, oh, I feel bad for him or her, But we have to try and maintain constant body weight as much as we can. Next slide. So how do we do that? So then this comes into the 2,000 calories per day. So according to USDA, an average healthy woman should consume between 1,600 and 1,900 calories a day. And for men, we can consume between 2,000 and 2,500, depending on your level of activity. If your level of activity is spending whole day in front of the computer doing your IT work, cut down on your calories. So I've given some suggestions as to, you can divide your calories whichever way you want: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And these are some of the numbers that we are talking about here. Okay, so a bowl of kenkey, we all condemn the Ukraine war, but I noticed that one of the factors that has come out of the Ukraine war is the size of the kenkey is reduced in Ghana. So that's a good thing, right? A bowl of kenkey is about 780 calories. Okay. So if you are commanding 2 and 3 bowls of kenkey, that's a problem for breakfast. Okay. And you have people who are commanding 2 and 3 bowls of kenkey with fish. Fish is good. Fish really doesn't contain a lot of calories. But if you're having 2 bowls of kenkeys for breakfast, and then wache or mutuwe for lunch, and then fufu on top, man, you are killing yourself. So we got to watch it. We really got to cut down on, our caloric intake. So we see 1 drumstick is 145 calories. We don't do 1 drumstick. We do 4. So the fufu and the bamboo is all here. And our people from the coastal region in Ghana who are exposed to the white man's way of living, they have the sweet taste. So they know about carrot cake and chocolate cake and tiramisu. I'm from the Workable mountain. The only dessert I know is ofam. So,
What is that?
ofam. Can somebody help me? Abudugo. With nuts. Oh, don't forget the nuts. Oh, nuts, yeah. So if you have sweet taste, look at it. A slice of carrot cake is 500 calories. Okay, a slice of chocolate cake, 500 calories. And we don't do 1 slice, we do 2. And if you want to wash it down with some ice cream, 1 scoop of hot fudge, 300 calories. Yes, so the numbers add up pretty quickly. Yeah, next slide, please. So I just want to bring your attention to two organs, the liver. The liver plays a very important role in how we make. What happens is into the starches, which is then distributed to the rest of your body. The excess carbohydrate, the liver is able to convert it into fats, primarily to glycogen and to cholesterol, which is then stored in your fat cells. So again, the body is good at storing fat. We store fat for period of starvation. What we find ourselves in is we live in an environment where, for many of us, and thank God for that, there's not going to be starvation, at least, hopefully not in my lifetime. On the other hand, we are eating too much. Everything is in excess, known as this obesogenic environment, okay? So we have to know that, yes, we don't want to eat too much fat, but guess what? The body is able to convert excess carbohydrate to fat, okay? So how do we deal with some of the excesses? Next slide, please. Okay. I want to introduce fasting. Fasting is a very important, this ancient religious practice is a very, very important, one of the natural ways of staying healthy is through fasting. So when we fast, this is some of the benefits we get. It helps lower body weight. It helps lowers our cholesterol level, lowers blood sugar. In fact, fasting is really linked to reduction in a lot of diseases. Now, when we are saying fasting, the ordinary person would just say, oh, I'm fasting, meaning they are starving. But fasting is really abstinence from food with combination with spiritual well-being and meditation. That is the proper way of fast. The human being as we are is actually, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, let's look at it. When we talk about health, it has to be holistic. Our spiritual, our physical, as well as our mental or emotional well-being. So fasting, when it's done properly, is one of the most important, beneficial thing for our bodies. And even at the biological level, like I was saying, we store fat for period of starvation. And this is how human beings, we have adapted over the centuries. Okay? So the body needs time when it doesn't eat. It allows the body to begin to utilize some of the stored fat. We call it metabolic switch. And that is very, very healthy for us. It reduces a lot of toxins. You can even tell a child when he's sick, right? The last thing he wants to do is eat. Because that's the body's way of telling you, no, I don't want to eat food. I want to get rid of some of the toxins in our environment. But we live in an environment where it's like, eat. You are driving down the street and literally soda is jumping from the billboard and into your mouth. It's scary. It's scary the way the junk food industry, the aggressive advertising, it really, really is scary for our health. So next slide. So let me see. After fasting, yeah, so I hope we all indulge in some level of fasting. It depends on your physical health. So of course you can choose to fast half a day, a whole day, but eating 2,000 calories at 6 in the morning and then not eating anything until 6 p.m. and eating another, that's not fasting. So fasting is really cutting down on your amount of caloric intake. And of course, the most effective fasting is fasting for several days. The human body, by the way, can go without food for up to about 40 days. You'd be surprised. We can. We are really designed to do that. Okay. So, workable solutions, food to avoid. Western diet. Next slide, please. We got to stop eating this sort of diet. These are ultra-processed foods. And the junk food, they've done their homework. They know the foods that really please our mind. These are foods that basically feeds the mind, just like drug of addiction. It's sweet, it's tasty, it's way better than the food we cook at home because there's so much sugar and so much fat, saturated fat and artificials in it. Okay, and these are the foods that the Western world is providing us. Unfortunately, Ghanaians are getting hooked on some of these processed foods. So these are the foods that we really need to cut down Of course, some times of convenience, like, hey, I'm at work, I didn't take lunch home to work, I can just go once in a while, have fast food. But overall, these are not good for our health. Yes, so those are some of the things that we need to. And I also want to encourage all of us to, if you don't do your annual physical, it's very, very important that we know some of these numbers, okay? So our glucose level will help us to know if the numbers are too high, whether we're pre-diabetic or diabetic. So we can really do something about it. The number of our C-reactive protein is a measure of inflammation. There are electrolytes. Our blood, urine, nitrogen checks for our kidney function, and our lipids, triglycerides, of course, tells us the amount of body in our system. And as a cancer biologist, I also would like to encourage people to adhere to the age-recommended screening. One of the highly preventable cancers is colorectal cancer. If you are 50 or about 50 and you haven't done your colorectal cancer, please do it. There's nothing to it. I did mine when I turned 50. You know, it gives you peace of mind. If there's something detected, we have very good chance of treating it. And also, Africans in this country, we are highly susceptible to HPV virus, so it's important that we get screened for that. And of course, breast cancer screening and prostate cancer screening. So I really encourage us to really do our annual physical, so we have an idea of our numbers. And this will help us to say, okay, my blood sugar level is really higher than it should be, so let me cut down, be more conscious about my sugar intake and so forth. Okay. So I've really talked about obesity being a result of a lot of sugar intake, of too much food or excess food. But also I need to bring in the fact that obesity is one of the conditions that is controlled by genetics. You know? So when you see somebody who is excessively overweight, it's not because the person don't have control, but sometimes it's because of the genetics. This is why obesity runs in families, and we see that even for identical twins that are separated and exposed to different environments over several years, guess what, when you see them, they have more or less the same body weight. So obesity clearly is controlled by genetics as well. So really, in terms of looking at health, is how our environment is really interacting with our genetics. So a lot of diseases or a lot of conditions such as hypertension, some of the risk factors that are playing together. You have obesity, then obesity is just exposing you to all these chronic conditions. And then if you throw in high salt, if you throw in stressful environmental factors, this clearly is contributing to increased risk of obesity. Next slide, please. Okay. But the good news is that a lot of these conditions are preventable. Okay. So I always like to present this story about Miss Tracy Brown. She is the CEO of American Diabetes Society, which is ironic that she also is a diabetic patient. So she had diabetes for about 60 years, and then guess what? She changed her diet and she started avoiding sugars and processed carbohydrates. And as a result, she stopped taking her insulin. I'm not one to say, hey, don't take medication. Medication is important for certain conditions. But all I'm trying to present here is that some of these conditions, if it's caught early, is reversible by altering lifestyles. So we see another story about a 63-year-old man with a history of hypertension, high blood glucose, high cholesterol level, and he was taking so many medications, but drastically changed his diet to that of consuming non-starchy vegetables, legumes, beans, and over a 16-week period, the blood sugar went down, cholesterol level went down, everything went down, blood pressure went down, and eventually he came off his medication. And then there's a story about a cancer patient whose diet was that of the standard American diet, but again made a decision to switch diet to plant-based diet, and the results was remarkable in really remission of a lot of this condition. Okay, so lifestyle modifications can really help us in overcoming a lot of this adverse health. Okay. But so far I've really spoken about diet from a physical perspective. As we know, we are all spiritual beings, living in this body. So what is even more important than our physical bodies, our spiritual health, our spiritual wellness, our mental well-being. And thank God we are coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know about you, but being locked up in my house for 2 years has been tough. So it's great to all be here. So when we think about health, let's think holistic. Let's think our spiritual well-being, our spiritual connectedness with our Maker, our mental health, and our bodies. So PCA friends, colleagues, my wife at the back, my son at the back, prosper and be in health, even as your soul prospers. Thank you.